My wife mocked my cheap watch during a business dinner, and for the first time in 30 years, I understood that humiliation has a sound. It is not always loud. Sometimes it is the scrape of a fork against porcelain after everyone at the table has gone quiet. Sometimes it is the faint intake of breath from a stranger who does not know where to look. Sometimes it is the sweet, practiced laugh of the person who promised to love you, sharpened so carefully that only you can feel the blade go in. I sat beneath the amber lights of Ristorante Milano with my left wrist resting near my water glass, the old steel watch visible under the cuff of my navy suit, and I watched my wife Zoe smile at two potential clients, as if she had just discovered a stain on the tablecloth and wanted everyone to notice how graciously she was tolerating it. The watch was not impressive to look at. It had a plain white face, black numerals, a scratched steel case, and a leather strap worn soft from decades of heat, rain, work, sleep, grief, and habit. It had been on my wrist when my father died. It had been on my wrist when I married Zoe. It had been on my wrist through 30 years of birthdays, arguments, late mortgage payments, hospital waiting rooms, business flights, cheap motel breakfasts, and silent dinners where she punished me with the careful placement of her disappointment. To Zoe, it was embarrassing. To me, it was the last honest thing I owned. The dinner had started badly before anyone sat down. I should have known from the way Zoe inspected me in the hallway mirror at home, not looking at my face first, but at the suit, the shoes, the watch, the places where age and modesty had refused to cooperate with the image she wanted to present. She stood behind me in a black dress that looked simple only because it was expensive enough to make simplicity look intentional, her diamond earrings catching the bathroom light while she adjusted one of them and said, "Please do not do that thing tonight." I was knotting my tie, slowly because my fingers had gotten less patient with LL fabric after 61 years, and I looked at her reflection. What thing? She did not sigh dramatically. Zoe rarely wasted drama in private when she might need it later in public. She pressed her lips together, then smiled with the thin restraint of a woman trying to sound supportive while documenting evidence. The small man thing. I turned from the mirror. The what? She stepped closer, straightened my tie with two quick, efficient movements, and patted my chest as if correcting a child before a school photograph. You know what I mean, Dennis. The self-effacing jokes, the cheap wine, the way you talk yourself down before anyone else can. These people are not your co-workers from the warehouse. Richard Pemberton sits on boards. Henderson Development Group has connections. If this contract goes well, it could change our life. She paused, looked at my wrist, and the corners of her mouth tightened. And you are still wearing that thing. I slipped my cuff lower over the watch. It keeps good time. That is not the point. Her voice remained calm, but there was a small private cruelty in the calm. People like that notice details. They notice shoes, watches, tailoring, confidence. They make decisions before the appetizers come. I almost said that I had spent half my adult life in rooms with men richer than Richard Pemberton, men who wore handmade shoes and lied through perfect teeth, men who could tell you the value of your watch but not the name of the woman who cleaned their office. I almost said that people with real power did not need to perform it for waiters. I almost said many things, but 30 years had trained me to choose silence when silence might buy peace. That was one of Zoe's quiet victories. She had taught me to edit myself so thoroughly that eventually my own thoughts arrived already apologizing. At Ristorante Milano, the hostess recognized the Pembertons and became brighter when she said their name. Richard Pemberton was taller than I expected, with silver hair, broad shoulders, and the calm posture of a man who had never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. His wife Catherine was elegant in the way some women become when money has been around them long enough to stop needing announcement. She greeted Zoe warmly, then me with genuine courtesy, and for the first half hour I believed the evening might survive. The mahogany table gleamed under soft light. The wine list was thick enough to intimidate anyone who believed paper could judge them. Waiters moved through the room like dancers, pretending not to listen. Richard asked good questions about routing, warehousing, port congestion, last-mile partnerships, and whether our logistics firm could handle regional scaling without sacrificing reliability. I answered carefully and well. That was my world. Freight lanes, margins, carrier reliability, customs timing, dispatch failures, the delicate mathematics of moving things from where they are to where they must be before someone powerful starts asking why they are not there yet. I had never considered my work glamorous, but I had always respected it. Movement is civilization disguised as paperwork. Richard understood that, or seemed to. Zoe did not. She sat beside me with her charming dinner smile in place, but every few minutes I felt her disappointment like heat against my arm. When I ordered the house red, because the premium bottle Richard suggested cost more than our weekly grocery bill, Zoe's fingers tightened around her napkin. When I described our company as reliable but modest, she laughed and inserted, "Dennis is too humble," sometimes painfully so. When Richard complimented our retention numbers, she said, "If only that translated into ambition at home." Catherine glanced at me then, a small, quick glance full of discomfort, and I felt the old sinking sensation. Zoe had been doing this for years, turning my dignity into social currency, spending small pieces of me to buy sympathy, laughter, superiority. The first time, years ago, she apologized afterward and said she was just nervous. The second time, she said I was too sensitive. The 10th time, she did not remember doing it. By the 100th, I had learned to sit still until the moment passed. Then I reached for my water glass and my cuff pulled back. Zoe saw the watch as if it had leapt onto the table to ruin her life. Her eyes went to my wrist, then to Richard, then back to the watch. Her smile sharpened. "Oh my God, Dennis," she said, not loudly at first, but loud enough. "You are still wearing that old thing." Conversation at the table stopped in the subtle way conversation stops among people trained not to appear startled. Richard's hand paused near his wine glass. Catherine lowered her menu. I looked down at my wrist, though I knew exactly what was there. "It keeps good time," I said, the same weak sentence I had used at home, as if repetition could make it less inadequate. Zoe laughed. There was no humor in it. "Good time. That watch looks like it came from a garage sale." She turned to the Pembertons with a conspiratorial smile. "I have been telling him for years to get something decent, something appropriate. But Dennis has this thing about spending money on himself, even when it affects how people see him." "Zoe," I said quietly, a warning, a plea. She ignored both. "I know it sounds silly," she continued, and the real danger of Zoe was how reasonable she could make herself sound while being cruel. "But image matters in business. You know this, Richard." "Catherine, I am sure you understand. We are trying to sit here and talk about major contracts, and my husband insists on wearing a watch that looks like it survived a basement flood." Catherine shifted in her chair. "Sentimental things can be meaningful," she said gently, trying to give Zoe an exit. Zoe smiled at her with bright politeness and refused it. "Of course, sentimental things have their place. In a drawer, perhaps, or on weekends. Not at a business dinner with people who actually notice presentation." She touched my sleeve lightly, the gesture affectionate to anyone watching, controlling to me. "Dennis gets attached to the strangest things." The restaurant seemed to contract around our table. Conversations nearby softened. A waiter slowed, then continued past us with theatrical discretion. My throat tightened. I could have defended myself. I could have told her the watch belonged to my father. I could have said that she had never once asked why I wore it every day. I could have said the name Morrison and watched the table change. But old habits are chains polished by use, and mine held. "The watch has sentimental value," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. Zoe's eyes flashed. "Sentimental value does not pay bills, Dennis. It does not make people take you seriously." She leaned back, as if exhausted by the burden of being married to a man who required public correction. "Your father worked in a shipyard his whole life. There is nothing wrong with honest work, but must you carry every piece of that past on your wrist forever?" My father had not merely worked in a shipyard. He had owned shipyards. He had owned docks, warehouses, vessels, insurance arms, repair contracts, logistics corridors, and enough quiet influence in East Coast maritime commerce that senators returned his calls before lunch. But Zoe did not know that because I had hidden it from her. Or more precisely, I had hidden it from the version of the world that wanted to decide what I was worth before deciding whether to love me. When I met Zoe, I had already walked away from Morrison Maritime. I wanted to be Dennis, not the heir to a private maritime empire. I wanted one person to look at me and not see doors, accounts, leverage, introductions, legacy. I wanted love to arrive without an audit. For a few years, I thought it had. I was wrong, but wrongness sometimes takes decades to finish revealing itself. Richard cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should look at the menu," he said. It was a kind intervention, but Zoe had already drawn blood and did not need to keep cutting to enjoy the wound. She gave a soft laugh, touched my arm again and said, "Yes, let us order before Dennis tells you the entire history of that watch. He can get emotional about the oddest things." I looked at my plate. The table blurred slightly, not from tears, or at least not ones I allowed to fall, but from the effort of remaining composed while something inside me bent past its limit. The dinner continued. People ordered. Wine was poured. Richard asked 2 more business questions, but his earlier focus had cooled. Catherine became kind in that careful way people become when they have witnessed a private cruelty in public and cannot decide whether acknowledging it would make the victim feel worse. Zoe sparkled, trying to drag the evening back into usefulness. I answered when spoken to. The deal, I knew, was dying. Who would trust a man whose own wife treated him like an object lesson in failure? Near dessert, Zoe excused herself to the restroom. She left her napkin on the chair and her perfume in the air. For a moment after she walked away, nobody spoke. The silence she left behind felt almost physical. Richard looked down at his wine glass, then at my wrist. His expression had changed. Not pity, not discomfort, something sharper. Recognition held under restraint. "Mr. Morrison," he said quietly, "may I see your watch?" I blinked, thinking I had misheard him. "My watch, yes." He looked almost embarrassed by the urgency in his own voice. "Please." I unbuckled the strap and handed it to him. The leather was warm from my skin. Richard received it with both hands, not as a man humoring a sentimental client, but as someone receiving an artifact from a wreck. He turned it over carefully. The case back caught the amber light. His thumb moved once across the engraving I had barely looked at in years, initials worn shallow by time and contact. W.M. He went still. The color drained from his face so quickly Catherine sat forward. "Richard," he did not answer her. His breathing changed. He looked up at me, and the room around us seemed to fall away. "Where did you get this?" His voice was low and strange. "My father gave it to me when I graduated high school." Richard swallowed. "What was your father's name?" "William Morrison." The words landed between us like a dropped glass. Richard's hand trembled. Catherine stared at him, alarm rising behind her composed face. He looked back at the watch, then at me, then stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping the floor. Diners turned. He did not seem to notice. "William Morrison," he whispered. "Then she has no idea who you are." Zoe returned at that exact moment, lipstick freshly applied, face bright with the artificial ease she wore after repairing herself in mirrors. She stopped when she saw Richard standing with my watch in his hand. "I hope Dennis is not boring you with stories about that old thing," she said. "He does get attached." Richard looked at her then, and whatever he saw in her face made something harden in his own. He did not respond. He handed the watch back to me slowly, carefully, as if returning something sacred. "Keep it safe," he said. "It is more important than you know." Zoe rolled her eyes slightly, just enough for me to see. "Say, Dennis, people are polite. That does not mean they agree with you." Richard reached into his jacket and took out a business card. He pressed it into my palm. His fingers were cold. "Call me tomorrow morning," he said. "Not about the contract, about your father." Then he turned to Catherine and said we should go. Zoe spent the entire drive home cataloging my failures. She did it with the focused precision of a woman balancing accounts. I had been awkward. I had made the watch a topic. I had ordered the wrong wines. I had looked wounded, which made people uncomfortable. I had failed to project confidence. I had let Richard leave without confirming next steps. I kept both hands on the wheel and watched the road unspool beneath the headlights. The watch was back on my wrist, heavier than before. "Are you even listening to me?" Zoe asked. "Yes, then say something." I looked at the reflection of her face in the dark window, sharp cheekbones, perfect lipstick. Anger arranged into disappointment because disappointment gave her the higher ground. Richard recognized the watch. Richard was being polite. "No," I said. "He was not." She gave a short laugh. "Dennis, please. Not every awkward silence is a mystery. Sometimes people feel sorry for you." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Something in me had begun to separate from the old pattern. Not enough to speak fully. Not yet, but enough to notice the pattern while it happened. That was the first crack in the wall. I did not sleep. Zoe did eventually, after turning away from me with a theatrical sigh, as if my silence had forced her into loneliness. I lay beside her in the dark and turned Richard Pemberton's business card over in my fingers until the edges softened. At 3:47, I gave up. I went downstairs to the kitchen, made coffee, and placed the watch on the table beneath the fluorescent light. In that harsh light, it looked ordinary again. Scratched, worn, unimpressive. I thought of my father's office overlooking the harbor, the salt air coming through open windows, ship models lining mahogany shelves, the smell of tobacco and leather in his jacket. I was 18 when he gave me the watch. He had placed it in my palm and closed my fingers around it with both of his hands. "This has been in our family for 3 generations," he said. "It is not about what it costs, it is about what it asks of you." I had laughed then, young enough to think wisdom should be clearer. "What does a watch ask?" He looked at me for a long time. My father had eyes that made men straighten. "Choice," he said. "The choice to be who you really are, not who the world expects you to be." I had thought walking away from Morrison Maritime was that choice. My father died at 62, alone in his office at 2 in the morning, one hand on a stack of acquisition papers, the other inches from a phone he had not reached in time. I found out at dawn. By then, the company was already preparing its statements, already translating a man into continuity language. Founder, visionary, leader, survived by. I inherited shares, voting rights, trust structures, properties, advisory authority. A future entire rooms of men expected me to step into. I looked at my father's empty chair and saw not power but consumption. I saw missed dinners, postponed vacations, my mother's quiet loneliness, my own childhood spent learning that the company could enter any room without knocking. So I walked away. I liquidated what I could, placed most of the rest in trust, stepped back from formal control, and took a logistics job under a manager who had no idea my last name once opened doors on 3 coastlines. I wanted to earn my hours, not inherit them. I wanted love without leverage. I wanted a house where nobody looked at me and saw a balance sheet. When I met Zoe, she seemed like proof that the choice had been right. She was a receptionist at a law firm then, quick-witted, beautiful, ambitious in a way I mistook for aliveness. She said she was tired of men who measured themselves in cars and watches. She said she wanted simplicity, sincerity, a man with steady hands and honest eyes. Our first apartment had peeling paint and a radiator that screamed in winter, and she laughed there. She cooked pasta in a chipped pot and danced barefoot to songs from the radio. She kissed me in grocery store aisles. She said my old watch made me look loyal. I believed her because I needed to. For the first 5 years, I thought I had found the real life I walked away to find. Then desire changed its clothing. At first, Zoe only noticed things. Her friend Patricia's husband bought a lake house. Her coworker received diamond earrings for an anniversary. A neighbor traded in an old sedan for a German car. "Must be nice," she would say, light enough to deny. Then she began comparing. Then she began correcting. Why did I not apply for director roles? Why did I not network more aggressively? Why did I not care about executive presence? Why was I comfortable with average? Average became her dirtiest word. It infected everything. Our house was average. Our vacations were average. My suits were average. My ambitions were average. Eventually, I realized she no longer described our life. She prosecuted it. I sat in the kitchen before dawn, watching the second hand move around the watch face, and I saw 30 years with a clarity so severe it felt almost violent. Every apology I gave to stop an argument, every purchase I avoided, because I knew she would call it cheap if inexpensive and irresponsible if costly. Every dinner where she corrected a story, every party where she joked about my logistics brain, every time she said, "Dennis means well," after I spoke, as if kindness were an intellectual disability. I had called those moments marriage. I had called my endurance love. I had called my silence peace. The watch ticked steadily on the table, indifferent to my self-deception. I called Richard at exactly 9. His assistant put me through so fast I knew he had been waiting. "Dennis," Richard said, and the relief in his voice unsettled me. "Thank God. Can you come to my office today? Is this about Henderson Development?" "No, it is about William Morrison, and it is about what your wife does not know." 2 hours later, I sat in his office on the 42nd floor of the Pemberton building. The city spread below us like a map belonging to men who believed height was a moral achievement. Richard did not offer small talk. He looked older than he had at dinner, or perhaps merely unguarded. He asked what my father had told me about the watch. I repeated the words about 3 generations and choice. He closed his eyes briefly. "That sounds like him." Then he opened a wall safe hidden behind a painting and took out a wooden box. Inside was an identical watch. Same steel case, same plain face, same quiet authority. He placed it on the desk between us. "In 1987, he said, I was 28 and 6 weeks from bankruptcy. My father left me a shipping company with debt, aging vessels, and contracts we could not fulfill. Banks would not touch me. Competitors circled like gulls around a sinking boat. Your father called me into his office. I thought he was going to buy us for scraps. Richard's fingers hovered over the watch. Instead, he gave me $5 million. No collateral except my word. Minimal interest. Pay it back when I could. The only condition was that I accept this watch and wear it until I understood what trust meant. His voice tightened. I paid him back over 15 years. Every cent. But by then Pemberton Development existed because William Morrison chose not to let me disappear. I stared at the watch in the box. My father had helped companies quietly. I knew that in vague outline. I had heard stories after his funeral, men I did not recognize shaking my hand with tears in their eyes, saying, "Your father gave me a chance. Your father saved our yard. Your father believed us when no one else did." At the time, grief made everything distant. I had not understood the architecture of his generosity. Richard did. He told me about the Morrison 12 original board families, whose watches were commissioned in 1943 by my grandfather for men who rebuilt East Coast shipping after the war. Only 12 existed. The watches were not just expensive, though Richard said mine was likely worth $75,000 or more to the right collector. They were markers of trust, inheritance, reputation. To certain men in certain rooms, the watch identified bloodline more effectively than a signature. "Your father spoke of you," Richard said. "Not often. He was private. But when he did, there was pride. He said you walked away from the machinery because you wanted to know whether life had weight without money pressing down on it." Richard studied me. He worried the world would punish you for that. He worried you would mistake being unseen for being free. I looked away. The windows reflected my face faintly. Older than I felt, smaller than I had been born to be, but perhaps not in the way Zoe believed. "The trust?" I asked. Richard nodded. "Still intact. More than intact. Your father anticipated you might step away and might one day return, or might not. The trustees preserved your position. Morrison Maritime is valued around $800 million now. Your personal trust, roughly $250 million. The numbers entered the room without touching me at first, too large to feel real. Then they began attaching themselves to moments. Zoe clipping coupons and calling it sacrifice. Zoe marking grocery store flowers. Zoe saying sentimental value did not pay bills. Zoe humiliating me over a watch that could have paid for her car. Richard leaned forward. "Dennis, I'm not telling you this to dazzle you. Money dazzles fools and traps the lonely. I am telling you because last night I watched your wife humiliate the son of William Morrison in public over the symbol of his family's honor, and I watched you accept it like a man who had forgotten he was allowed to stand." Shame rose hot in my chest. I wanted her to love me without money. And did she? The question was not cruel. It did not need to be. I had no answer. Richard gave me one anyway. "Stop pretending to be poor to test someone who has already failed the test." When I returned home, Zoe was in the living room flipping through a magazine, legs crossed, one shoe dangling from her foot. She did not ask where I had been. She looked at the clock, then at me. "You are late. Patricia made lunch reservations. You need to shower and change." I stood in the doorway and looked at her as if she were a stranger occupying the shape of my wife. The living room seemed smaller than ever. Beige walls, store-bought furniture, wedding photo on the mantel, a life constructed from careful restraint and private contempt. "We need to talk," I said. She did not look up from the magazine. "If this is about last night, I am not apologizing for wanting you to make a decent impression. Richard knew my father." That made her pause. "So, my father was not a shipyard worker." She closed the magazine slowly. "Dennis," the warning tone, the one that meant, "Do not embarrass yourself." "My father owned Morrison Maritime." I said it plainly. She stared at me. "What? The shipyards, the vessels, the warehouses, the trust structures, all of it?" Her face went through the first stage of disbelief, which looked almost like irritation. "That is not funny. No, your father fixed boats. My father owned the places where boats were fixed." I walked farther into the room. "The trust he left is worth approximately $250 million. Morrison Maritime is worth about $800 million. For 47 seconds, Zoe said nothing. I counted by the mantel clock because if I did not focus on something mechanical, I might focus on her face, and her face was telling me too much. Shock came first, then the quick backward search through 30 years of marriage, then anger, then something bright and naked that made my stomach turn. Greater, not wonder, not grief, not the hurt of a wife learning she had been kept outside a secret. Greater. She stood abruptly. You let me think we were struggling. We were not struggling. We clipped coupons. You clipped coupons because you said it made you feel responsible, then resented me for not stopping you. Do not turn this around on me. Her voice rose. 30 years, Dennis. 30 years you let me live like this. Like what? I asked. In a safe home with bills paid and food on the table. In mediocrity. The word came out before she could dress it up. There it was, the old religion. Mediocrity. The small god she had served while calling it ambition. I told her why I had hidden the money. I told her I wanted to be loved as Dennis, not as William Morrison's heir. She laughed once, a brittle sound. That is romantic when you are 29. It is insane when you are married. Is it? Yes. Marriage means sharing everything. You did not want everything. You wanted the parts that could buy status. Her eyes hardened. I wanted a husband with drive. You wanted a husband you could display. I wanted not to feel embarrassed. That one should have hurt less after the restaurant. It did not. Then she changed tactics. I watched it happen. Her shoulders dropped. Her voice softened. She came to sit on the arm of my chair, touching my shoulder with a tenderness that once would have undone me. Dennis, listen to me. I am angry because I am shocked. But maybe this is a blessing. Maybe this is our chance. We can access the trust. We can travel. We can buy a real house. We can finally be happy. Finally, she blinked. What? You said finally be happy. She hesitated. You know what I mean. I do. I looked at her hand on my shoulder. What if I said no? Her hand stiffened. No to what? No to changing our life. No to accessing the trust for lifestyle. No to the house, the cars, the clubs, the jewelry. What if I said we continue living simply? She stared at me as if I had suggested burning money in the fireplace. Why would you do that? Because I like simple. No one likes simple when they have options. I do. Then you need help. The words came too quickly. Too honestly. I asked her whether she would stay married to me if the trust remained untouched. She did not answer. She gave me arguments about security, opportunity, adulthood, shared assets, my obligation to her as a wife. But she did not answer. So I asked smaller questions. Ones a wife of 30 years should have carried easily. When is my birthday? She frowned. October. The date. Dennis, this is childish. The date. She looked away. The 15th, 23rd. Her cheeks flushed. You never make a big deal of it. What is my favorite food? You are not picky. Blueberry pancakes. My mother made them every Sunday until she got sick. I told you that many times. This is unfair. What is my biggest fear? Oh, stop. My biggest fear is spending my life with someone who sees me as a project to fix instead of a person to love. Zoe's eyes filled with tears then, but I could no longer tell whether tears were truth or instrument. We can go to counseling, she said. I can change. I do not want you to change into someone who performs love because money is at stake. She recoiled. That is cruel. It is accurate. The next 3 days were a slow domestic suffocation. We moved through the house like actors, rehearsing separate plays on the same stage. Zoe became polite. That was worse than anger because politeness was strategy. She made dinner and left it on the counter. She wore softer clothes. She asked how my day was and listened to the answer with visible effort. She touched my arm more. She called me honey twice in one evening, after months of using my name like punctuation. At night, I lay awake beside her and felt the calculations moving in the dark. She was not waiting for my heart. She was waiting for my resolve to weaken. On the second night, I found her in the kitchen at midnight with her laptop open. The screen quickly dimmed when I entered. Trust law, spousal entitlement, hidden assets marriage. She smiled too brightly and said she could not sleep. Richard connected me with James Patterson, counsel for the Morrison Maritime Trust. James spoke in precise sentences and had the calm of a man who had managed generational wealth long enough to know that money did not ruin character so much as reveal its existing fractures. He explained the structure. The trust was separate property, inherited, protected, never commingled. Morrison Maritime had continued under trustee governance, expanding my father's model of ethical loans partnership investments, and salvage of smaller firms crushed by predatory competitors. Your father left instructions, James said. Not commands. Instructions. He wanted you free to choose. That word again. Choice. I felt cornered by it now, not because others forced me, but because I had spent 30 years pretending not choosing was humility. It had been fear. On Thursday evening, Zoe staged her final performance. She dressed in the navy blue dress she wore to weddings and charity lunches, arranged herself in the chair where the window light softened her face, and waited for me. I have been thinking, she said, about what you said, about authenticity. She pronounced the word as if it had an unpleasant texture. She told me I was right, then explained why my rightness should lead to her outcome. We could use the money for good. We could support charities, schools, the environment, children. When I asked which charities, which schools, what children, what environmental work, she faltered. For one naked second, frustration flashed across her face. Then came honesty, angry and exhausted. Fine. Yes, I want a better life. I want nice things. I want to feel proud when people ask where we live. Is that so terrible? No, I said. What is terrible is making me your excuse for not having them. She cried then. Real tears, I think. Not pure tears, but real enough. She admitted the house had never been enough. The car had never been enough. My job had never been enough. She had married the man I was, and spent 30 years grieving the man she thought she could turn me into. I kept thinking if I pushed you harder, she whispered, if I embarrassed you a little, if I made you uncomfortable, you would wake up. I was awake, I said. You just hated the life I was awake in. She covered her face. I almost comforted her. My body leaned forward from old training. Her pain still called to me, even after everything. That was the cruelty of long marriage. Love becomes muscle memory long after trust dies. I stopped myself. I told her I had spoken to the lawyers. Hope lit in her eyes so quickly, it destroyed the last soft thing in me. Dennis, she breathed. That is wonderful, we can. I am accessing the trust, I said, so I can settle our divorce cleanly. The hope vanished. Her face went white. Divorce, yes, no, she stood, then sat, then stood again. No, Dennis, we are not doing that. We are upset. We are confused. We are making emotional decisions. I have been emotionally undecided for 30 years. This is the first clear decision I have made in a long time. She became angry, then pleading, then practical, then cruel, then pleading again. She said I owed her. She said she had given me her life. She said no woman would have tolerated my lack of ambition. She said she could destroy me socially. She said she loved me. She said I was abandoning her. She said I was punishing her for wanting more. She said she was sorry. She said I would die alone. She said it all in 1 hour. And by the end I understood that she was not trying to reach me. She was trying every door in the burning house of us, looking for one that still opened. The divorce was quieter than I expected and uglier than people outside it ever knew. Money made the legal process efficient, but it did not make the emotional process clean. Zoe received the house, a generous settlement, and more financial security than she had ever imagined when mocking department store suits. She also received the social story she wanted for a while. She told people we had grown apart. She told others I had hidden things. Both were true, though not in the way she meant. She moved to a larger house in a better neighborhood within months, joined the country club she had once circled like a locked garden, and began dating a plastic surgeon named Richard Cole, who wore watches designed to be noticed. I returned to Morrison Maritime. 6 months after the dinner, I stood in my father's old office overlooking the harbor, and nothing about it felt victorious. The room still smelled faintly of leather, salt, and old paper. The ship models remained on the shelves. The desk had been restored but not replaced. Through the windows, cranes moved slowly against the gray sky, lifting containers from vessels with the patience of ancient animals. I had imagined, in some private revenge fantasy I never admitted, that returning would feel like stepping into power. It felt instead like entering a room where a dead man had been waiting for me to grow up. The trustees welcomed me with warmth and caution. Employees watched me with curiosity. The industry noticed. Articles were written. Richard Pemberton gave interviews about my father's integrity, and did not mention Zoe. I wore the watch every day. I changed less than people expected. I kept my old sedan for a while, then replaced it only when the transmission failed. I bought better suits but refused flashy ones. I learned the company slowly, respectfully, not as an heir reclaiming a throne, but as a son trying to understand the machinery his father had loved and survived by not being consumed as completely as I once believed. The Morrison model had evolved. We still issued loans to small maritime and logistics firms when banks turned them away, but never without mentorship, never without accountability, never to trap founders into surrendering control. My father's notes were everywhere in the archives. Trust given is not charity. Trust is a demand that a person become worthy of it. I read that sentence one night and had to sit down. Sarah and David Chen came to my office on a rainy Tuesday in October. They ran a small logistics firm specializing in sustainable short-haul freight and port emissions reduction. Their technology was sound, their contracts promising, their cash position terrible. Banks wanted collateral they did not have. Venture capital wanted ownership they could not afford to lose. Sarah spoke with the controlled urgency of someone refusing to beg. David had circles under his eyes and a folder gripped so tightly the corners bent. I listened for an hour, not just to numbers, to the way they spoke to each other. They disagreed twice, respectfully. Sarah corrected a projection and David thanked her. David admitted a mistake in expansion timing, and Sarah touched his wrist once, not to silence him but to steady him. That small gesture stayed with me. I approved the loan, $800,000, structured with fair terms, advisory support, and no predatory equity. Then I opened the drawer and took out one of the replica watches we now gave to founders accepted into the Morrison Trust Partnership Program. Not a Patek, not rare, steel plain face, leather strap, a symbol, not a lure. I fastened it around David's wrist and told him what my father had told Richard. Some things matter more than money. Trust once given is sacred, David cried. Sarah did not, but her hand found his again. That should have been healing. People would tell it that way if they wanted a neat ending. Humiliated man discovers hidden legacy, leaves cruel wife, returns to empire, continues father's work, finds purpose. It is a good shape for a story. Too good. Real life resists good shapes. At night in my father's office, after everyone left and the harbor lights trembled on the black water, I still heard Zoe's voice saying garage sale. I still felt the table at Ristorante Milano go silent. I still remembered the way I sat there and took it. Not once, but for 30 years. Wealth returned my options. It did not return the man who had surrendered them piece by piece. Purpose gave me direction. It did not erase the fact that I had chosen a test of love and remained in the room long after the test had failed. Ellen Martinez entered my life through an article. She was a widowed retired teacher who freelanced as a journalist and came to interview me about Morrison Maritime's community investment program. She wore a gray sweater with ink on one sleeve, drove a 12-year-old Honda, and asked better questions than business reporters with national platforms. She asked what my father feared. She asked what I had misunderstood about him. She asked whether generosity could become control if the giver needed gratitude too badly. She noticed the watch but did not ask what it was worth. She asked whether it was heavy. I said sometimes. She nodded as if that answered more than I intended. We had dinner weeks later, then coffee, then blueberry pancakes in her small kitchen, made from scratch after I once mentioned my mother. She remembered. That nearly undid me more than any grand romantic gesture could have. Zoe had forgotten my birthday. Ellen remembered pancakes. But even there, I was not restored. I want that understood. Ellen was kind, and kindness after long contempt can feel dangerous. Sometimes when she complimented me, I became suspicious. Sometimes when she asked what I wanted, I did not know how to answer because wanting had atrophied under years of being told my wants were small. Sometimes she touched the watch and I went still, not because of her, but because my body remembered a restaurant table. She noticed. She always noticed. You do not have to become comfortable quickly, she said once. We were standing in her kitchen, rain tapping the window, pancake batter resting on the counter. I am not asking you to be healed so I can enjoy you. I laughed because the sentence was too precise and too painful. That is a strange thing to say. It is a true thing to say. She went back to stirring batter. Sit down, Dennis. Tell me about the young couple you helped today. So I did. I told her about Sarah and David, about their business, about the watch, about how David cried and Sarah held his hand. Ellen listened without turning my story into a reflection of herself. That was new. That was almost frightening. Zoe called that same week. I let it go to voicemail the first time. The second time I answered from my office because the harbor was gray and I felt strong enough or foolish enough to believe strength could be scheduled. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. "Dennis, I hope I am not interrupting." She told me she was fine, then spent 3 minutes proving she was not. The house was beautiful. The club was nice. Richard Cole was successful. She had been to the Amalfi Coast. She had bought the kind of watch she once wanted me to wear. Then she went quiet. "I read the article," she said. "The one about the small businesses." Ellen wrote it. Another silence. "Ellen, yes, are you happy?" I looked at the harbor. Happiness had become a word I distrusted when spoken to directly. "I am honest more often," she exhaled. "That sounds like something you would say now. Maybe it is something I should have said before." She cried then softly. She apologized not for the divorce, but for making me feel like I was never enough. For a moment, I believed the apology. I still believe part of it. People can be sorry and still remain themselves. She said Richard gave her everything she thought she wanted, but comfort was not the same as happiness. I said no, it was not. She said, "You were always enough, Dennis." I just could not see it. The words should have healed something. Instead, they arrived late to a room already cleared out. After we hung up, I sat at my father's desk until the office darkened. I did not cry. That would have been easier. I felt something colder than grief. Something like the final settlement of accounts. Zoe had loved a future she believed I owed her. I had loved a past I believed proved my purity. We had both used the marriage as evidence in private arguments with ourselves, and between those arguments 30 years disappeared. That was the devastation no money could repair. Not that she failed to love me as I was, not even that I allowed it, but that I had hidden my name to find real love, and in doing so built a life around a test instead of a truth. Zoe failed the test. So did I. Months passed. Morrison Maritime grew under my leadership, though I disliked that phrase. Sarah and David succeeded. Richard Pemberton became a friend, though he never again mentioned the restaurant unless I did first. Ellen remained, not as rescue, not as reward, but as presence. Zoe remarried Richard Cole the following spring, in a ceremony photographed for a society magazine. In one picture, she stood beside him wearing emeralds, and a smile I recognized too well. She looked triumphant. She looked lonely. I closed the browser and did not look again. On the first anniversary of the dinner at Ristorante Milano, I returned there alone. I do not know why. That is not true. I know why, but the reason was not noble. I wanted to see whether the room still had power. The hostess did not remember me. Of course she did not. Restaurants witnessed too many quiet executions to memorialize each one. I requested the same table. It was available. I sat where I had sat. The lighting was the same amber softness. The mahogany still gleamed. The menu had changed slightly. I ordered the house red, not because I could not afford better, because I wanted to know whether choice felt different when money was no longer hiding behind it. The waiter poured. I placed my wrist on the table and looked at the watch. It was still scratched, still plain, still absurdly valuable in ways visible and invisible. My father's initials remained worn but readable. The second hand moved with patient authority. I thought about calling Ellen, then did not. I thought about calling Richard, then did not. I thought about Zoe sitting beside me a year earlier, smiling as she cut me down, and I tried to hate her cleanly. I could not. Hate would have been simpler than the truth. She had been cruel. I had been absent from myself. She had wanted a life I refused to name. I had wanted love without risk and called secrecy virtue. We had punished each other through the shape of our unmet desires, until contempt became fluent. A couple at a nearby table laughed softly. The sound made me look up. The woman touched the man's wrist, admiring his watch. He smiled and turned his hand so she could see it better. A harmless moment, tender perhaps. I felt something close inside me anyway. That is what remained. Not bitterness exactly, not fear exactly. A permanent caution, a scar that had learned manners. I finished dinner slowly. The food was excellent. The wine was ordinary and good enough. When the check came, I paid with a black card Zoe would have worshipped if it had appeared in our marriage, and the sight of it gave me no pleasure. Outside, the city was cold. I stood beneath the restaurant awning for a moment, buttoning my coat, feeling the watch beneath my cuff. My driver waited at the curb, but I did not move toward the car immediately. Across the street, reflected in dark glass, I saw myself, 62 now, wealthy, respected, desired in rooms that once would have terrified me, free in every legal and financial sense. I also saw a man who had spent 30 years shrinking inside a life he designed to prove he was lovable without proof. A man can reclaim his name and still mourn the years he spent not answering to it. The watch ticked against my wrist, steady as a verdict. My father had called it choice. He had not warned me that every choice leaves a ghost life behind, pacing somewhere in the dark, wearing the face of the person you might have been if you had chosen sooner. I got into the car. The driver asked where to. For a moment, I almost said Ellen's address. Then I said the harbor office. It was late, but the office would be empty, and emptiness no longer frightened me as much as performance. The car pulled away from the restaurant, and Ristorante Milano slid behind us in the side mirror, warm, polished, indifferent. At the office, I stood by the window until after midnight, watching cranes move under floodlights and ships shift slowly in their berths. The world was still moving cargo from one place to another. Steel containers, grain, engines, medicine, furniture, flowers, watches, lives. Everything had a route, visible or hidden. Everything carried weight. I touched the watch and finally understood that my father had not given me a symbol of wealth or even legacy. He had given me a witness. It had watched me disappear. It had watched me return. It would keep watching now that return had failed to make me whole. In the morning, I would approve another loan. I would call Ellen. I would answer Caleb from accounting about port delays. I would continue the work because work, at least, allowed repair without pretending nothing had broken. But that night under the harbor lights, there was no triumph, no warm ending, no neat justice served to a cruel wife and a restored man. There was only time, still moving, and a man standing inside the life he had reclaimed too late to recover the years it cost him. I survived Zoe. I survived my own silence. I survived the revelation of who I was. Survival was not peace. It was simply the fact of still standing after the room had emptied, and the applause, if there had ever been any, was gone. The watch ticked once against my wrist, then again. It did not forgive me. It did not condemn me. It only kept time, which was the most brutal kindness it had left to give.